welcome everybody. Really happy to have you here today, whether it's your lunch break or you've dedicated some time to join the webinar today. Welcome. This is part 2 of our 3-part series covering the ISO 27001 changes. If you weren't able to join part 1 of this series, no worries. Feel free to subscribe to the Risk 360 YouTube page. You can find my video there, as well as a bunch of other content if you have not seen that page. So definitely check that out, and you can reference back to part 1. So yep, welcome. Happy to have everyone here today. We'll get into it. All right, just a little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me or wasn't able to join the first webinar here in this series. I'm the ISO service line manager at Risk 360. If you have not heard of Risk 360, it's an Atlanta-based information risk management firm. We also have our GRC platform, Phalanx, that we sell as well. And I'll be referencing that throughout this webinar. So feel free to check out our website. For my primary responsibilities, I'm primarily focused on helping our implementation service line clients get ISO 27001 certified. And I've worked with a lot of clients from small startups to SaaS orgs, software companies, to large, complex, and publicly traded organizations. So a lot of the recent conversations that I've had with my clients over the past 6 months has really been around transitioning to the new 2022 standard if they are already certified against the 2013 standard. So I hope to bring some of that content and context to this webinar today. If you are not friends with me on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out after this webinar and I'd love to link up. All right, so a little bit about the agenda, what we'll cover today. If you're an executive buyer looking to get ISO certified, you're likely going to need to understand what it's going to take for your organization. If you're really interested in hoping that your compliance program can reduce risk and minimize cost while also increasing your revenue, then hopefully some of what we discuss in this webinar will be your considerations to begin or continue your journey with ISO. In this webinar, I'll cover really the basics of where to start and the importance of your internal audit. We'll talk about the cost and resource implications for your organization if you're new to ISO or if you're transitioning to the new standard. And then finally, we'll wrap up with the timeline for transitioning that was recently published by the International Accreditation Forum. I know they previously published some information back in August, so I'll provide some updates there. If you're not familiar with the IAF, they're essentially a global organization of accreditation bodies that promote confidence in quality and standards. So you may be familiar with ANAB or UCAS. They're members of the IAF and audit your certifying body. So essentially it's the committee that audits your auditors is the way that I think about that. All right, so let's get into it here. Again, if you're looking to get certified, the first thing that you need to do is undergo an internal audit. If you're new to ISO, I would recommend watching our previous webinars that cover ISO 27001, clause 4 through 10. That gets into some more context here about the internal audit, but the necessity for completing an internal audit has not changed with the new standard or new version as well. So it should be conducted annually and in alignment with your audit plan. I would say the outcome of your internal audit will be key and should be a key strategic artifact, as that will and should serve as your baseline for everything that needs to be implemented prior to your external audit. The standard also does require independence. So unless you have someone internally with the skill set and can justify independence, then I may recommend outsourcing this piece of your audit, especially if you are a small organization and this may be a new motion for you. It really, it does become a full-time job, and you want to make sure that you're investing upfront here to ensure the internal audit piece is done right, and is right-sized for your organization. It can be more than a check-the-box item if done right. All right. So to expand on the internal audit, just know that if you're taking the time and investing in this piece, it may feel very similar, and it should feel similar to your external audit. If you're new to ISO or going through this for the first time, you likely know what I'm talking about here. It's because it's evidence driven, and because you're gathering evidence from various teams that you may not be familiar with working with, it can feel clunky because it's just a new motion for everyone. So there is a good chance that you may struggle here, but that's the point. Really, the point is to make sure that your internal auditor is getting all up in your business and is uncovering any sort of skeletons that you may have prior to that external audit, so that you're able to better articulate gaps in the context of your business, and you're better prepared for your external audit and can speak to the controls within ISO. I've seen people use various methods here, whether it's a questionnaire, check the box questionnaire, and that may not be giving you the results that you need really to move the needle. So take the time here to determine how you want to plan and set up your audit program and invest in quality audits. I would say a good audit defines the structure and responsibilities for planning, conducting, reporting, and following up on audit activities. And if you don't have a champion that's dedicated within your organization to support this, as it does quickly become a full-time job, then you may not be setting yourself up for success here. The more thorough your audit, as I mentioned, the more you can leverage the results, whether that's leveraging the results for other frameworks if you want to expand, from ISO into SOC 2 or high trust. It is a universal standard. So if you're careful in the way that you're selecting your controls and implementing them and testing them, then it will really set you up for success as you continue to expand upon the program. The output of this not only is a critical component of your certification process, but also it should provide you with a punch list of exactly what needs to be addressed to be ready for certification. So this will be your roadmap, as I mentioned, to certification, and give you the list of remediation items that need to be remediated prior to the external audit. Something to consider here is the hours also, from like a cost perspective of your internal audit. Typically, what I would tell my clients is that from a leadership, your leadership team will probably need to allocate about 10 hours of their time for this internal audit. The bulk of the efforts will be on your security and GRC or compliance teams. That'll probably be around 15 to 20 hours, depending on the scope of your ISMS. And then other teams that may be impacted will be like your IT teams. They'll need to speak to the networking controls. I would say anywhere from 8 to 10 hours for them as well. And then same goes for the engineering team to speak to any sort of management, change management and development activities. HR may be impacted from probably about 4 hours to speak to some onboarding during employment and post-employment activities. All right, so let's get into the cost implications of updating to the 27001 version. Just know that, let me break these out a little bit for you guys. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword here and could be widely different depending on a variety of factors. These costs are based on ranges for the clients that I have worked with. So, just know that it will be dependent on many factors depending on like the size of your organization or the scope. So for your internal audit, you probably want to budget, if you're a small, let's say a small firm with one service offering, you're looking at probably something closer to $35K versus highly complex org with multiple products. You could be looking at anywhere from 100 to 150K on that. If you have, or are considering merging your information management system, let's say with maybe a privacy management system, that could also impact the cost here of your internal audit, depending on, how extensive and the additional add-ons that you want to include there. Also for your risk assessment, so this is another requirement for ISO that has not changed, from the new version as well. Your risk assessment, it can be done in-house, but it could run you upwards of 100K depending on, also the size of your organization and the services and the products that you have. If done in-house, you'll just want to factor for whether or not you have resources to support that, because it can become a time-consuming effort, and following up on the output of that risk assessment as well as a requirement. So you'll want to think about if you do have resources that are capable with the skill set, but also the time to support that. And then for remediation, so your remediation costs based on the outputs from your internal audit and your risk assessment will also need to be considered when looking to implement ISO, and will vary really depending on the maturity of your organization. So for tools, as an example, let's say you have a gap, you're not conducting annual security risk and awareness training. Well, you may want to look at a training platform. Those things can add up, but there may be some workarounds to that depending on the level of maturity of your organization. Also, I would recommend looking into a GRC platform here and having a centralized location to track compliance activities and vendor management activities. So, I've just seen a lot of clients struggle to communicate any security needs to their stakeholders, especially now that we're working in a remote environment. So it is likely worth investing in some tools to help foster collaboration across teams, while also having tools that can provide for easy reporting capabilities. This will really be critical for a healthy and mature program. Obviously I'm biased. We have, as I mentioned earlier, a Phalanx tool that has various capabilities. If you're curious about that, reach out to me. But really, as far as like a centralized location to track your compliance activities, it covers everything from your risk management piece to your program management to your vendor management, and everything really in between as far as reporting as well. So yeah, factor in some considerations to the tools that you might need in ramping up your program. From a people perspective, you may be looking at anywhere from 0 to 200K, could potentially be more. If you have other compliance frameworks that you're already aligning to, then you may just be able to tack this on and really not need to hire anyone else here. But if it is a brand new motion for you, you may need to hire someone within the organization that has worked with security frameworks in the past, who may be familiar with ISO and can understand what it's going to take to get your organization certified. So really, you may want to budget anywhere from 1 to 3 people here to get your program off the ground. Also, to consider, when you're transitioning to the new standard, if you don't have someone that can dedicate, I would say like 15% of their time to really reading and learning and understanding the changes to the standard, then you may want to consider hiring someone that can take the time to do that. Or, consider advisory services, which is the next bullet there. Do people within your organization know what they need to do to transition? Or do they know what they need to do post internal audit to implement and remediate the controls in order to get certified? The worst thing that you can do is get through your internal audit and then be left with a list of gaps and really have no idea where to start with remediation. If this sounds familiar, or if you have run into this in the past, then you may want to budget for additional advisory services or outside consulting to help push things forward. So some of the takeaways to the cost implications, and we'll get into this a bit more with some of the new controls and the cost implications there. But if you are just transitioning from 2013 to 2022, the cost for you will likely just be a fraction, if that, of the cost that I just previously mentioned. You likely already kind of have the teams and the infrastructure in place for that transition. It may just be a matter of actually looking at the standard and understanding the controls to figure out if there's any additional tools or resources needed for implementation of the new controls. And I'll get into that here in a minute. But the cost, also the startup costs from 2013 to now will be the same. Your internal audit is a requirement still, your risk assessment is a requirement. All of the clause 4 through 10 controls are still required there. And then also something to consider is examine the net new controls. Make sure that there's someone internal within the organization, or if you're outsourcing this, great. But make sure that the new controls are reviewed, but don't conduct an off-cycle audit only for these 11 new controls. I know a lot of my clients have asked about that and what the best approach is. And I think really, if you're just looking at the 11 new controls in an off-cycle audit, you're likely spending time, money, and resources to do that, and may not have a full picture of what those changes are or what the gaps are against the new standard, because there are, a lot of minor tweaks within the changes, within the controls that have merged. And so if you're just looking at those 11 net new controls, it will give you a good idea, but it's not going to give you the whole picture of what needs to be implemented. So, consider that as well. I would just recommend during your next internal audit, if the time is appropriate for you, to just go ahead and do your internal audit against 100% of the new controls. There are some tools out there. I know, again, Phalanx is an example where there's a self-assessment that can give you a general idea. You can kind of do that on your own time. That will generate a good starting point for you that will minimize the cost and effort, versus trying to just look at those 11 in an off-cycle audit period. All right, so consider what new tools or people the organization may need to address the new controls. So below, and I'll talk through each of these, there are a few considerations that I would say, based off of our analysis of the new standard, that may impact your bottom line, may impact the need to hire additional people or to go out and procure more tools, more so than the other new controls. And so, that's why I want to spend some time on these 4 listed here today, as they may have the greatest impact from a cost and resource implication. So the first control here is around threat intelligence. I know I talked about threat intelligence in the previous webinar here, but really the standard is making sure and wanting to understand how you're collecting threat-related data and whether or not, and some considerations that you should think about is whether or not you have qualified personnel to analyze it. So great if you're gathering, maybe you already have some threat intel tools that you're using, but how are you actually proactively using those tools and to embed them in your preventative and detective controls? The standard is looking for organizations to ingest threat intel information at 3 levels within the organization: strategic, tactical, and operational. So your strategic threat intel will be more of like your exchange of your high level information about changing threat landscape. So the types of attackers that may be out there, or the types of attacks, versus your tactical threat intel. That's going to be more information about attacker methodologies and tools, I would say. And then your operational threat intel, that's going to be like specific details about specific attacks and technical indicators of those attacks. So, I think there's a lot of tools out there that can be used, but more importantly, like the resources that'll be needed to take that information and actually be proactive in updating your preventative and detective controls. So like, let's say your company receives intel indicating that a specific type of malware is being used to gain unauthorized access to sensitive data. Well, then you should probably have someone be proactive and go and update your monitoring tools as a detective control. Or from a preventative control, let's say there's a phishing email is circulating, you receive intel that a phishing email is circulating. Well, you may use that information then to go block emails containing certain keywords or attachments. So think about that like from a investment perspective, both from tools and resources. Another option here is to invest in maybe some threat modeling to identify the critical assets that may be more prone to attacks. That may help minimize, and filter down like all of the noise that you may be receiving there. But really, despite I think the cost with investing in this, it's much better to do this up front than to be breached, and so it's probably an easy consideration for the organization to factor in. There's many tools out there as well. Let me know if you guys have questions on that, but you can subscribe to like threat intelligence platforms. There are some free publicly available information there as well. I know there's like dark web monitoring tools or various feeds that you can track to understand about the emerging threats that are happening within the industry. The next control is around configuration management. So consider investing in automated deployment tools for baseline images to enable efficiencies and ensure this control is operating effectively. If you're manually deploying images to your prod environment without using any sort of automated tools, then it's likely that it is time consuming and error prone. So I would recommend investing in some automated deployment tools, and as your applications grow in complexity, you will want to consider investing in these tools, and your dev team will likely thank you for it. So the standard here is really, I think, one notable difference that I would say here. I mean, configuration management is implied all throughout 2013 as well. Many organizations likely already have this, but there will be kind of stricter requirements when it comes to auditing and the evidence around how you are leveraging standard secure templates or standard templates for secure configuration. So, there are tools out there that can help you with that. I think Kubernetes and Docker are some that I've heard of organizations using and being successful with. If you think of this as almost like your golden image, configure once and apply to many. So like from an OS, let's think of like an OS example. Every laptop and server should be built on that same OS image using a secure configuration standard. So consider that and consider investing in some automated deployment tools that will harden your network, and your dev team will thank you for it. These tools can be costly, but over time, I think you'll see a return on investment there and a more secure environment. All right, so the next control is around data masking. This is a new control within the 2022 standard. Many of you may already be doing this if you're complying with GDPR, but if you're not keeping track of your data flow, you'll likely need to spend some time here. If you handle a lot of PII, then this will be big for you to comply with here. And so auditors are going to be looking to ensure that data has been adequately anonymized, pseudonymized. So, there are tools out there that can be fairly pricey, but that can help automate that as well. If you're not familiar with what this is, basically it's just making sure that you can't pinpoint, a specific user to their data. So replacing like their specific identity with a pseudonymized identifier. There's like some differences definitely between the two, anonymized and pseudonymized, but at the end of the day, it's really basically like if you think of personal information, let's say your database has John Doe and he was born on May 5th, 1990 and has type 1 diabetes. Like this will basically help to not be able to identify that user. So he would have his own separate ID. His birth date would be more generalized. So it may be like ID 4545. He's 30 years old and has diabetes. So the auditor will just be looking to make sure that your data has been adequately anonymized. You can't link that data back to a specific user. Like I said, some of you may already be doing this if you're complying with GDPR, but that will be consideration to your costs if you don't already have tools in place for this. I think there's like other ways that you can do this as well, like randomly generating numbers and hashes, and then also like counter methods. So a lot to consider on that control there. And then lastly here, this one is going to be interesting to see how organizations implement for data loss prevention. I'm sure many of you on this call today understand what DLP is. I was reading an article a couple of weeks ago that the enterprise DLP industry is going to be like a $7 billion industry by 2026. And the driver for that, I would say, is pretty clear, right? Like there's been an increase in cyber attacks through phishing emails. There's an increase in communication, remote communication. Since COVID, we're all primarily working remote. And so there will need to be some consideration here if you're looking to implement DLP. If not done right, like there can be significant impact to the business. So there may be some like availability within your standard, like out of the box, like Office 365 subscription, I know has some DLP capabilities, but not all of them. So make sure you have someone within the organization, if you plan to go that route, who is capable of understanding that and understanding the implications of implementing DLP, right? Like if it's not done right, there could be many distractions or disadvantages that hamper the productivity of your deliverables. I've heard that it can be heavy on your network and it can slow things down. I've heard that it can generate weird like application behavior if you're not setting it up properly. And then also, it could potentially keep data hostage and critical emails may be missed. So consider and do your research on what the right tool is for you when it comes to DLP, and potentially even investing in additional advisory services there. I know a lot of the tools out there, you can buy just the tool, but you can also purchase some advisory support to help set things up properly. All right, so now we've talked a little bit about the tools and the cost implications. I want to get into some of the resource implications as well, as far as the resources that are needed to update your ISMS, and also just if you are new to the standard, be integrated in your implementation of your ISMS. So bottom line is you'll need a dedicated person to oversee the compliance program if you don't already have one. And depending on the size of your organization, you may need 1 to 3 people. These individuals, like I said, with the internal audit, like this should be and can become a full-time job. Keeping up with remediation efforts, being kind of the liaison between all of your teams, because to this next point here, you want to elicit buy-in from other departments that are affecting the ISMS. I know I mentioned the time that time considerations for each of those teams that may be required, but you also want to keep them as an integral part within the remediation step and phase of your program, because if you're creating this in a silo, then you're likely left with an increased risk of single point of failure, and then it's just not baked into your program. So if you consider implementation of some of the tools we just discussed, champions of the teams will likely need to weigh in also from the tools perspective on what specifically it will take to implement. For example, you likely won't want to invest in some sort of automated deployment tools without discussing this with your dev team. Understanding the requirements and what they need to be successful with that implementation just creates a better culture, a better environment, and then teams that are more likely and willing to get on calls with auditors and explain your process so that it's just one cohesive unit, and everyone understands the need and the ask and the drivers behind getting certification. And again, like there will need to be someone that can speak and understand the tools that we were just talking about, and they need to have the bandwidth to operate them. So this does take time. Like I said, if you are transitioning from 2013 to 2022, even if you're not planning to transition this year, go ahead and start looking at the standard. Have someone, allocate a champion who can start reading through the standard and understanding the implications, because this does take time. This does not happen overnight, and there will need to be teams and departments involved in pushing things forward. Otherwise, you're just creating your program in a silo. And so the next time the change rolls around, it's going to be a more difficult lift as well. All right, so let's get to the timeline a little bit. Really, so I guess this was August of 2022, the IAF issued information about the timeline for transition. Organizations, and then in February of this year, they actually came out with an updated document. Not sure if, maybe that was due to needing some more time, but in short, basically to summarize what that said, is organizations currently certified to the 2013 still have 36 months. So nothing has changed for that. The deadline is still October 31st, 2025, unless you are doing a recertification review, in which case that recertification review must be performed against the new standard starting on or after April 30th, 2024. And then organizations who are not yet certified cannot perform initial certification review against 2013 starting on April 30th, 2024. So this is a 6-month increase from what I previously communicated and what the IAF previously communicated from the original IAF document that I referenced. So in other words, organizations starting their initial certifications review on or after April 30th, 2024 must have that initial certification review performed against the 2022 standard. And then again, there are no changes to the deadline for already certified organizations. That remains as October 31st, 2025. Another way I guess to say this, because it may be confusing, is that if you are prospective, if you're new to ISO, you have until April 30th, 2024 to continue using ISO 27001 2013 for your initial certification. So if you plan to get your initial certification this year, you can actually get that against the 2013 version if that's something you're interested in. But after that date, after April 30th, 2024, organizations must conform to the 2022 version for initial certification. So really that's the bottom line with the updates there. I know a lot of certifying bodies plan to have, and in theory, you could actually be certified against the new version as early as April of this year. I've talked to a couple of organizations that are certifying bodies that are planning to be ready by April of this year, but definitely talk to your certifying bodies. They have to get all of their tools and their things set up as well to make sure that they can audit against the new standard. So all of this to say, and really just to wrap up, bottom line is you should already be looking at the new standard. If you're new as well, to ISO, you should be looking at the new standard. However, transition when it makes the most sense for you and your organization, knowing that those two key dates. You want to think through the cost implications. You want to think through the resource implications. Speak with your internal audit advisors if you have them. Speak with your certifying bodies. Assign champions within the organization that can spend 15% of their time learning the new standards requirements. And if you do all of those things, then you will succeed here. If you don't have someone that is actively reviewing and understanding the changes, then you may be slightly behind the curve, which can make things more difficult when trying to create your business case for investments here when the time comes for additional tools and resources. Again, as I mentioned, this should not be done in a silo, and you should solicit feedback from your key teams so that they know when the next change rolls around that this is already baked into your culture. How you build your compliance program, how are you building your compliance program with time in mind? What can you invest in today to protect your house tomorrow. All right, so thanks for joining today. Really appreciate the time and happy to open it up for any questions.
Thanks so much, Leah. All right, you guys, so we already have a couple of questions that have come through. If you do have any additional ones, please go ahead and feel free to add those now, and we'll make sure to get to them. So the first question I'm seeing here is, what are some DLP tools that you'd recommend?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So feel free to reach out to me after this call as well, and I'd love to hear more about your specific business and the services that you provide. But some of the big ones that I've seen organizations be very successful with are Digital Guardian, I would say, and Symantec are a few, as well as McAfee. So each of those offer varying subscriptions as well as support that you can invest in as well to make sure things are set up properly and that critical information is not missed when setting up those rules.
All right, and then the next question I'm seeing here is that you mentioned that leadership should invest approximately 10 hours of their time in the internal audit. Why is that?
Great question. Yeah, so if you're new, if you're already certified against 2013, you likely know the reason behind that. But if you are new to ISO, I'd recommend first off going and reading and looking through some of our other videos that cover clause 4 through 10 in ISO 27001. But if you don't have, I guess bottom line with most other things within the organization, if you don't have leadership's input, then you run the risk of not aligning your information security management system or your ISMS with business and security objectives. And then it again just becomes not baked into your organization, not baked into the day-to-day, and it may not be impactful, and you may not be reaching the full maturity of that ISMS that you could. Clause 4 through 10 is really all about how you're structuring your information security management system and analyzing the drivers behind obtaining certification. And if those factors, if your internal executive team does not understand the drivers or does not have input into the why behind certification, then you may again be at risk there. But yeah, like I would say, there are some walkthroughs and tactical areas that they need to be involved in with the initial setup and helping to define the scope and really helping to define that top level documentation so that your program can be run succinctly with the business objectives.
All right. Next question here is, do you have to perform an information security specific risk assessment, or is a generic enterprise risk assessment enough?
Yeah, so that's also a great question. Really, an enterprise should be enough as long as you have, and you're conducting interviews with your security team and you're having them weigh in and giving their input on the specific risks of the organization from a security perspective.
All right. The next question here that I'm seeing is that I'm seeing that this is part 2 of this webinar series. Where can I watch part 1? So you guys, for others of you that might be having this question as well, I actually just shared out the link to the part 1 of this series in the chat of this webinar, so you can find the link to it directly there. All right, and it looks like that is all the questions we've got for today. So thank you, Leah, so much for taking the time to host our webinar. We really enjoyed it. And thank you all for joining us today.